And the reason I'm sitting behind here was not just to laugh towards the audience at your jokes, but was because your work as a writer of 30 years ago or informed how I saw Adrian Villar Rojas' work when I came across a young artist who built a whale out of unfired clay on the bottom of Patagonia that had washed up along the coasts that nobody would see under a forest except for a few scattered human beings in the lowest part of Earth before Antarctica, as a survivor of a future world where the world had gone underwater and then somehow had melted and somehow had come washed back up onto that beach, and he made it. To make a long story short, so that is why we're all sitting here on this stage. So Adrian, what I'd like to start you off, you don't need me to speak, but I wanted to suggest that you might explain why. I mean, you were in the Extinction Marathon in Serpentine many years ago, in my Documenta many years ago, and before that also in Argentina, making works that spoke about a post-apocalyptic world, or a kind of adolescent sci-fi imagination of a world after the world, but somehow there were humans, and in that world, or some species, in that some species that were huddled together, they were not firing clay, but they had fire again, as if the future of this post-apocalyptic world were a world with fire and some sort of sexual relationship with Neanderthals, or maybe not. So fire and unfired clay in your work. And that went on and on and on to become this extraordinarily kind of optimistic oeuvre around composts and composting and sticking stakes into cement blocks on the High Line in New York, and leftovers from restaurants in New York, and making strange life, biological life, in an exhibition, for example, in your solo show in London some years after. So I know you now. I mean, I know two artists who are somehow really involved in this in very, very opposite and different ways. One is Pierre Huyghe, and one is you, completely opposite ways. But this idea of composting life, composting life in a post-apocalyptic moment, which is the imaginary system that you brought and somehow canonized in contemporary art. And we are so grateful to have your work here at the Castello di Rivoli. Two works, actually, one which is on long-term loan from the Fondazione Ceriti per l'Arte, which is one of the animals that escaped the earth and then escaped the sea to come back to the earth, of the Istanbul Biennale, and the other is a fossilized tree with a dead bird on it, but that speaks of death, but speaks also of life. So I don't know how to continue from the dam, except that I really like this idea of making the dam. I would like to find some funders, and I would like to make a new documenta on the 7 kilometers, and we could just run the whole thing in my old age. But I think it's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant idea.
Hello?
Hello.
Is it working? I think we're gonna need the clicker. And thank you so much for this beautiful presentation, Caroline. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody. Thanks for the invitation, Agnieszka and Caroline and the sponsors. And thanks everybody for your time, for listening to us, to all of us for so much, so long, which is, it's a beautiful chamber of listening to each other, which is many times very difficult, right? To listen to others talk. So, yeah, I think when I'm, just to answer hopefully very briefly to this context of how I displace my work and most of what I do, if not all, to this space-time where perhaps human species is not longer around. And many times I think about that and ask myself, probably now at 43, I have better answers than when we met, and I was probably 30 at that time. So I think I cannot disconnect myself from the history of my country. I'm Argentine Peruvian. So I'm a person who was actually born in a country that was going through a dictatorship with 30,000 disappeared people. So I think it's important to gonna backtrack 2 seconds. I mean, there are many different ends of the world. There's gonna be many different, and there've been many, many ends of the world. So this is, when we talk about the end of the world, I guess it's always good to put it in between inverted commas and analyze what type of different communities and civilizations have gone through already ends of the world. So I think I cannot disconnect myself from that, the event of dictatorship and the 30,000 disappeared people. Later on, in my early 20s, I cannot disconnect myself from the economical crisis of 2001 in Argentina. I cannot disconnect myself as someone that was studying arts at the same year that the 2001 economical crisis occurs. Just, the 9/11, September 11 occurs. So I think many times when I question myself why I went into that direction, I go back into these time markers. This is just to say something very, very briefly about that. And the other question, which would be a much more epistemic, related to arts answer, is that I felt extremely asphyxiated by the ready-made and contemporary art practices, where through the appropriation, the symbolic appropriation of the world, through the ready-made, somehow the map meets the territory. And when I found myself with this dead end at a very young age, I was like, why we are still doing this sort of thing we called art, in between inverted commas. And the only answer I found was to go to the very end of the species and to the very, very end of, again, many inverted commas, cultural production, right? Like human noise. So that was kind of my answer to a deadlock. And now rewinding and going back to the theme of energy, what we are looking at is 2022, 2023. This is a fragment, a section of a work that occurred at the Bass Museum in Miami. What you're looking at is a reproduction 1-1 of the David by Michelangelo. It's done in clay. And it's sitting basically atop a replica of 1969, a very specific section of the moon, where the moon landing, the Apollo 11 mission occurred. And we only have 10 minutes, so I'm gonna go very fast. The basic principle of this section of this larger installation, but we're talking about this specific section, is space exploration, space colonization, and future mining of the moon, among many other celestial bodies. So I was extremely interested in how we can discuss museums and exhibitions and colonial appetites, and what it means that humans are going to explore space, because when we say humans, it's a very complicated way to use the word, because which humans will go in which capacity and for what. So I discovered that basically the moon, let's say the footprints of Neil Armstrong are still intact on the moon. So if we would all magically appear on the moon now, we would find everything as it was, probably bleached because there's sun radiation, very high sun radiation, but it's a very thin atmosphere. So basically there's now many museological, like museum epistemes investigating this in different agencies all over the world on what will happen and if we have to preserve this as a memorial monument to, let's say, first time humans, inverted comma, sit on, put a foot on the moon. And again, in relation to our topic, energy is a big question. So the topography is a document, but at the same time holds markers that function as symbolic representations of post-war conflict, because this is contested land, of course. And then we are going to go into fire. So this is 2019, and this is the old Uderkerk. This is the oldest church in Amsterdam, and this is a wonderful institution, art institution, that has, I think, in itself has embodied many of the problems of the exhibition making, right? It's a place for ritualistic, metaphysic explorations in many different directions, art and then religion. So it's an active church and it's an active art exhibition display place. So basically, through replicating the mechanisms, infrastructure used during WW2 to protect monuments and memorials, I built a new architecture on top of the church, basically obscuring the church. And what you're looking at is basically a church functioning in complete darkness and only with a firelight. So this is real fire from candles. These chandeliers were hanging from the ceiling of the church, and they were put down and on these pedestals, and basically have candles again. So we reactivated them because they were functioning with electricity. So I'm very interested in the material agency of fire and this contract that institutions have. I mean, we are very visual creatures. So we basically, most of what we do, and perhaps we do better than ever, maybe, we look at things. It's basically most of what we do. It's a hypertrophied. It's our capacity to be optic beings, basically big eyes, no? So art institutions have this, let's say, contract with the spectators, that they have to see something. So I'm always very interested in this aspect, the material aspect of how we use fire, what for, and how how little candles you need to lead a 3,000 square meters church. So this is a vast, huge space. And there are other aspects of this exhibition that I don't think are worth mentioning now, related to what we're talking about, which is fire and energies. But here you can see how these devices, where the matrices and the wooden scaffolding is blocking basically the light, which is in itself an extremely, let's say, contrarian symbolic operation over what a church and sunlight should be doing together, right? And this is the theater of disappearance. The project before was called Poems for Earthlings, and this is the theater of disappearance. We're gonna go through very rapidly through these ones, because this is not part of what, this is what we are gonna talk about. We are gonna talk about, again, fire. And again, this, I would say, probably very similar things about how this space, this whole room, 400 square meters, it was basically lit with fire.
Yes, I have a question about this. When I walked, this is the second floor of Kunsthaus Bregenz, and when you walk in, you see the Guernica, or a reproduction of the Guernica. You see a floor which is made also of fossils of some strange old thing from the planet, and the fire was not in the center of these stone chairs of a very modern architecture, to recall what Beatrice was talking about earlier. The idea of the round circular fireplace is a very modern idea that now is not being used anymore. So there was this obsolescence of the 60s or 70s in the piece, and a space that looked like a ritual had taken place, a strange ritual of beings that had left only the fire but had disappeared. I never understood what this meant. On top of the Madonna del Parto, what did it mean? And also the illustration of the prehistoric person coming from the famous illustrator of books. What's the name of the painter who,
Yes. Sedenek Burian.
Yes. So what, I finally get a chance to ask you, what the hell did this mean?
In front of everybody, here, without even telling me you're gonna ask that question. Thanks. And record it, and online. Yeah. Well, what it meant. I think there's something to be said about the qualities of this space. This is kind of the reboot of the White Cube, but concrete bunker version. I think I think you've read it quite well, actually. There's an intention to generate this sort of empty space, but actually a space that has been inhabited, and it has been inhabited by very privileged beings. So there's something about this being a bolt, potentially a bolt of some sort of knowledge, a very selective knowledge. I think one thing to be said about the setting of this show. There's no one receiving you at the entrance, so there's all the museological symbolic presence, the apparatus where the museum says, I'm here, I'm present, I'm receiving you. We are going to engage in this contract where you're going to walk around my space and I'm going to show you stuff and potentially you're going to learn something. There's no one receiving you. There are no labels. There's no wall text. There's no name of an artist. So there's some sort of, again, let's say, intensification of this emptiness and this lack of, let's say, meaning production from like a curatorial, museological perspective. I think the aggregation of elements, I think as you walk through, you're received by the Madonna del Parto, which is, I would say, a marker of Western culture, but at the same time, this is a very soft beginnings of the reboot, what we understand as a reboot coming out of medieval times of Western culture, and in this case, Italy. Italy, I mean, it had a lot of knowledge exchange with the Mediterranean area. We were talking about the Mediterranean area, but this is something that perhaps it's not said or underlined as much as it should be. So it seems like the Renaissance happens as some sort of alien spaceship and humans awake. So there was to me, it was quite important to somehow trust the audience into this floor where you're walking through this painting. Actually, I mean, the photograph is framing that floor in a kind of perhaps too perfect way. I think when you walk into that space, you cannot really tell you're walking on the Madonna del Parto. Probably you can tell you're walking through some patches of color, and perhaps then after like much more bodily investigation, you can really tell what you're walking on. And then you keep on ascending through these different floors. The flooring is made out of marble. This is a marble that contains fossils, like 400 million year old ammonites. These are the very first early complex creatures that ever lived on planet Earth. And I think, to me, putting all these elements together basically relates to the history of Austria after WW2, how many bunkers were found with art looted. So there was all these different symbols working and layers of, I think also here we have these different correlations of deep time and painterly representation. I always had this theory that there's this painter I'm obsessed with, Charles R. Knight. Most of his work is at the Natural History Museum in New York. And at the same time, he's painting deep times in perhaps what's regarded as the most finest and most precise way up to that time. So 100 years ago, these paintings were high technology, that the dinosaurs paintings and that are at the Natural History Museum. At the same time, Duchamp is creating the ready-made. So I was like, if this man, instead of the painter, instead of taking his paintings into the Natural History Museum, he would have taken them into the Armory show, what type of like revolution of arts could have happened, So that's another signifier here. And then we have this Neanderthal man, which is an exhibition. We saw the painting. I don't know if I can go back, but well, that's on the left. So you have all these paintings hanging and dripping, trickling from the ceiling. So we open the ceiling, the glass ceiling, and the paintings. You can see that the Guernica it's amplified, so you cannot feed the room. And it's kind of almost being baked. It's being roasted by the fire. So the paintings are in this very like kind of dangerous hazard. But the Neanderthal somehow represented some sort of, Guernica and Picasso was always like there's a famous quote by Picasso that says that when he saw the Lascaux, the cave paintings, he said, Lascaux, why have we been painting? Like why we didn't stop 20,000 years ago? So anyways, there was all this like family of situations occurring there. Whew, I don't know if I answered. We don't have any more time. We have?
Not really.
Okay.
I think it's fine, unless there's something special, because we're moving over.
Yeah.
That's okay?
It's okay.
Allora basta. Thank you.